And to kick us off this morning, Pastor Gary is going to be sharing. He is a mighty man. He's married. He's got two beautiful children. He actually works at Cigna, which is one of the top 5 Fortune 500 whatever companies here in America. You've been working with them for over 30 years. I think about 30 years he's been working with them. He's a leader in the industry. And I think the person he's speaking about today, he actually exemplifies that. He's generous, he knows the word, and what I really love is that him and his wife, Donna, they actually lead our marriage group. And so they're helping people find success in the area of marriage, and I look at him and I think it's #goals. I love you, I'm grateful for you. Come on, would you just be upstanding right now? We love to honor all around upstanding, and let's shout him down, come on. Let's encourage him as he brings the word. Have fun, have fun.
Hey, good morning, church. Good morning, church. You can have a seat. You know, some of you might have come this week expecting to hear a good-looking pastor with a real Australian accent and a really terrible Jamaican accent. Well, today I want to tell you that you get a good-looking pastor with a real Jamaican accent and a terrible Australian accent. I sound like Anna Delvey from, if you guys watch Netflix, like Anna Delvey. Pastor T, Pastor E, really thank you for the opportunity to serve. I want to tell you that Pastor T and Pastor E are more than just family. They're my pastors and it's incredible leaders. I love you guys a lot. I love you guys not because I have to, because you gotta love family, but because because you guys are just so great. So just give them a round of applause. Great leaders, great people. A couple weeks ago, a 19-year-old kid named Isaac died. Now, Isaac was a student at the University of Florida, and he came down with a stomach virus, and his stomach virus progressed to, he got a high fever, and then he got listless, and then by the time his mom, got to him, he went into cardiac arrest. And after that, it was just kind of downhill from there. His internal organs started failing, and after that, he started to have some internal bleeding. He had swelling on the brain, and 2 days after that, they declared him brain dead. Now, I knew Isaac since Isaac was 10 years old. He actually grew up kind of in my home. When I say he grew up in my home, he was always visiting, and he was a member of our student ministries at the church that I was a pastor at. And you might say it was a pretty sad story. Well, and it is if you are, his family and his loved ones. But for Isaac is looking pretty good right now. He's enjoying life, and we're kind of happy for Isaac. But as Don and I were up in Gainesville sitting with the family, and the night they declared him, we're there, something happened that was kind of stood out to me, and it actually became the basis for this message. Now, there was a stream of young people just keep walking, actually a stream of people walking in. There are people who were his ministry partners, there are people who were his schoolmates, there are people who went to youth group with him, there are people who played ball with him, people who played tennis. By the way, he and Andrew taught me how to play tennis. Andrew, one of our sound guys in the back. And, they were telling their own personal stories. It's like, man, Isaac, and he's, telling, man, remember this time we were playing ball and we were laughing and we were joking, just reminiscing. And then they would end it with something like this, and Isaac, man, he lived right. It's like, it's like, oh man, I played tennis with Isaac. Man, Isaac, he lived right. I served in ministry with him. Isaac, he lived right. And I was just thinking about that. I was I'm like, gee, if they could sum up my life in one sentence, or maybe a few sentences, what would the tagline of my life be? Like, what would the tagline of your life be if people could sum it up in a sentence? And oftentimes we ask those questions. We think about it like at funerals. We think about like, man, what are people going to say about me? And the fact is that oftentimes we think about legacy. We think about your story after your story has already been written. But the reality is that your story is being written every single day. My story is being written every single day. And so the question I want to ask you this morning, the question I want to ask myself this morning is not what are people thinking about, what will people think about you, what will they sum up your life in after you die, but when you're not in the room and people think about you, what are they thinking about you? If they could sum up your life where it is right now, what are the top 3 or top 4 things that they would think about? You see, that's a question we all have to wrestle with. It's a question about legacy. It's a question of what history we are creating. But before we go any further, let me just commit this time to you. Lord, I thank you for each and every person here. Lord, I know that each and every person here is supposed to be here because I asked you to only bring people into this church who are supposed to be here. So Lord, I pray that this words that you've put on my heart will come out and touch where it needs to touch. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. You know, Pastor Terrence introduced us, and we're starting this series called History Makers in the Bible, or History Makers, people who change the course of history. And he mentioned, you know, in Hebrews 11, this great, and it's an interesting read, right? You should read Hebrews 11. It goes through all these people, and as it goes deeper and deeper into the scripture, it gets rapid fire. And it gets rapid fire, and it's just start mentioning names on top of names, till after a while, the writer is like, he can't even mention what they're doing. He's just mentioning names and names. And then he gets to a part where he's not even mentioning names anymore. He's just mentioning acts, you know, things that these people did. And then it gets to the end, and it turns around to Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, and this verse that was up there before. And it says, now then, or therefore, seeing that we're surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, and the way I think about it is that we have all these examples. Not only we have these examples, we have these people up in heaven who are cheering us on. They're cheering us on like, you can do it, you can do it. You know, let us run and throw aside everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles us. Today I want to talk about one specific guy, a guy by the name of Daniel. I was speaking with a Daniel back there today. I told him that my message is about him. It's about his name, you know, Daniel. Actually, we just said that, right? You know. But if you read the story of Daniel, you find some pretty interesting thing and pretty amazing thing about Daniel's life. Daniel was a conquered slave. Daniel was, but that didn't define him. Daniel was a great leader. Daniel was not only a great leader, Daniel had the ability to interpret dreams. And so he could tell you whether the dream that you having was for some bad food you had the night before or really meant something. Daniel was a great advisor. He was a man of great wisdom. You know, Daniel had all these things, but along the way, Daniel's path to the top didn't go like this. His path to the top went like this. And it trended up. Another way, some pretty amazing things happened to him. One time, Daniel was thrown into a den of lions. And the following day, they expected, you know, the lions are hungry, right? So they expected Daniel to be no more. And Daniel was, the following morning, he was chilling. He's just chilling. A bunch of lions, and I was like, come here, kitty, kitty. I don't know if he said that, but I'm just imagining. You know, it was like, come here, nice catty, nice, you know, whatever people say to cats. I don't like cats, I like dogs. You know, But you see, those stories are only examples of why Daniel was legendary, why Daniel was a history maker. But in order to understand how Daniel became a history maker, you have to understand what Daniel did to become a history maker, because we all know, right? If you take Journalism 101, that a good story has to have the who, when, why, and the what. So today we're going to talk a little about what Daniel did to become a legend. Daniel's story begins about 500 years before Jesus steps on the scene. And the Babylonian Empire, which was the world power of the day, they came in and they invaded Judah, which Israel was 2 countries, Israel and Judah. And they just came in and they just looted. And they took all the treasures. Not only did they do that, but they also went into the temple and they took out the artifacts that was meant for worship of Jehovah God. And they took it and it's like, now we're going to take these artifacts back to put it in our pagan temple to worship our God, a God whose name was Bel, or some people may know him as the name of Marduk. And not only did they do that, they captured slaves. And they captured slaves, and they said, we're going to take these slaves back to work to work in Babylon, and they said, all right, not only do we want to capture slaves, we want to capture some slaves that's going to work in the palace. And I like this. You know, the king Nebuchadnezzar, he gave his chief of staff, a man named Ashpenaz, some very specific instruction. I want to pause here and look at those instructions. He said, select only strong, healthy, good-looking young men. How many, well, except for, well, how many, you know, women would want that? You know, a strong, single woman, a strong, healthy, good-looking young man. And he said, make sure they're well-versed in every branch of learning, and make sure they're gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Pretty much he said, you know, of all the slaves that you capture, I want you to get some good-looking ones, but they can't only be good-looking. You know, sometimes they're good-looking, but they ain't got not much up here, right? So they got to be good-looking, they got to be smart, and they got to be wise. And he says, after you select them, I want you to do something else. I want you to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians and feed them with food and wine from the king's table. He's like, not only do I want them to be smart before, I want them now to be smart with Babylonian knowledge, and I want them to eat Babylonian food. Now you may think at a first blush that if you're a slave, right, it's not a bad deal, because being a slave is a horrible thing, and slaving off other humans is a horrible thing. But you know, the way slavery normally works is that, you know, there were two jobs, right? You're either a field slave or you're a house slave. One is much worse than the other. They're both horrible, but one's worse than the other. A field slave, you're out in a hot sun. Where I grew up in Jamaica, they have a way of turning words around. They say he'll be in the sun hut. They don't say hot sun, they say sun hut. And not only did being a field slave was that bad, you know, house slave was a better thing to do, because at least you're a slave, but you're inside. But there was a job that was even better than that. It was a palace slave in the Babylonian Empire. When I say better, I'm not saying good. It's just better than being a field slave. And if you're a palace slave or one of the palace advisors, you got to eat good food. You got to work out. You got to maintain your physique. You got to maintain Des and Troy and Vince and Sybil and whatever else Pastor T calls his guns. I don't know what I call mine. It's like Don and Na for Donna. There we go. There we go. Donna's my wife, by the way, in case you guys are wondering, like, who's this Donna? So you get to work out, you get to eat well, and you're eating really good food. There's only one thing you got to do. You know, you got to have a name change, but yeah, you know, you can deal with that because it's just a name, right? But you see, King Nebuchadnezzar had an ulterior motive. King Nebuchadnezzar was their enemy. He had conquered their land. He wasn't doing this out of his goodness of his heart. No, what he had wanted to do was he wanted to change their identity. He wanted to change their identity from Jews to Babylonians. And the culture of the Jewish culture was a very strong culture. You may not know it from reading the Old Testament. You see some pretty harsh things in there. But back then, in that ancient time, the world was a much harsher place. The Jewish nations were well known for being peculiar, for being a different set of people. First of all, they were not polytheistic. They didn't have many gods. They had one God. They didn't have an idol for their God. They just had a God who was kind of spirit. And not only that, they had all these laws and the customs that they say came directly from God. And King Nebuchadnezzar was like, no, we got to change all of that. And so you know that in order to change someone's identity, you got to do three things. You got to change the way they see themselves. You got to change what they put inside their bodies. And you got to change what they fill their minds with. And that's what King Nebuchadnezzar says. So this is what I'm going to do. So Ashpenaz, who was the king's chief of staff, gathered all the young men who met this criteria. He gathered all the people. And, you know, I have a vivid imagination, so I can imagine, you know, it's like take the shirt off and all the men with the big six-packs. I think I have a two-pack. Big six-packs were out there, and he's picked them out. And among the guys that he picked out were 4 friends. One's name was Daniel. The other one's name was Belshazzar, and the other one was Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And all these guys had names that their parents gave them. And their names that their parents gave them had a specific meaning, but not only did it have a meaning, in the context of their lives, those names indicated an identity. And King Nebuchadnezzar is like, no, I'm going to change their names. And so Ashpenaz changed their names. And so for Daniel, he called them Belshazzar. And Daniel's name meant before that, God is my standard. And Ashpenaz is like, no, you don't answer to God anymore. You answer to Bel. And Bel was also known as the god of destiny. He says that your destiny is no longer controlled by Jehovah God. Your destiny is now controlled by Bel. And in doing so, he changed his identity, Daniel's identity, from one of reassurance to one of discouragement, from reassured to discouraged. And Hananiah, whose name meant God is gracious, he renamed him to be afraid of God. To be afraid of God. And he took his name from one of security and one of fearlessness to one of a person being fearful. So now his identity was identified with somebody who's fearful. To Mishael, whose name meant there is no one like God, he changed his name to one meaning despised, contemptible, humiliated. He changed his identity from confidence to unloved. And Azariah, whose name meant the Lord helps, or God, and the connotations like God helps me like a father helps a son. He changed it to one meaning a person in bondage. He took his name and his identity from son to slave. And Ashpenaz knew this, that he knew that by changing what people call them, it would change eventually how people saw them. And when he changed how people saw them, if he did that long enough and they didn't check themselves, that eventually would change how they would see themselves. And eventually it would change their identity. But he not only did that, he's like, okay, I'm not only going to change your name, I'm going to change the food that you eat. So the king had assigned them a daily portion of food and wine. And this wasn't like bad food. This was like really good food. This was the king's food. It was in essence, in today's world, it would be non-kosher meals, right? They would have to eat crabs, lobster, shrimp, really bad food. No, really good food. Pork, bacon. That's what was on the king's table. And the king's table wasn't Manischewitz Concord wine. It was some, it was just some nice Malbec or whatever you guys drink, Dom Perignon. They said, you got to eat this food. And they said, all right. And not only that, we're going to give you a new education. You're going to be trained for 3 years in the University of Babylon. You can come out with a brand new degree. You're going to have the best education in the world. But what the king was really interested in doing, he was indoctrinating them. He wanted to give them a new identity. He wanted them to be immersed in Babylonian culture. He wanted them to become Babylonians. He wanted them to forget what they were born into. He wanted them to forget what God had called them into, what their parents had prophesied over them in a name. He wanted them to forget that, and he wanted them to become Babylonians. He says, I want them to think like Babylonians. I want them to act like Babylonians. I want them to eat like Babylonians. I want them to do everything that Babylonians do, and eventually they will see themselves as Babylonians. But Daniel took a stand. He says, no. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. The first thing he says that you can call me, Belshazzar, but I'm not going to accept the name. And how do I know that? Because you may say, well, Pastor Gary, I don't see that anywhere. Well, I know because Daniel wrote most of the book of Daniel, and he didn't call his book the book of Belshazzar. He called it the book of Daniel. He's like, I'm not going to take that name. And everywhere he referred to himself in the book of Daniel, it wasn't Belshazzar, it was Daniel. And Daniel did this, and Daniel did that, and Daniel did this, and Daniel interpreted dreams. And Daniel's like, you can call me whatever you want to call me. I know who I am. I know who I am. I'm Daniel. I'm Daniel. And Daniel took a stand. And then Daniel also took a stand, and he said no to the food. He said no to the food. And I like this verse here because this verse is really an anchor verse for me because it says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself. Not to defile himself. Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the pork, the bacon. Nah, you can eat jerk chicken. Just good thing is you can eat jerk chicken. Because jerk chicken is holy. Can you tell them? Anyway. And now it's like, I'm not going to eat that food. But, I can imagine his friends around. It's like, Daniel, just eat the food, man. It's good food. And I taste it. Is it really good? It's like, no, I'm not eating that food. Because that food has been offered to idols. And God told me not to eat that food. And so Daniel took a stand. And even though he got educated in the Babylonian literature and Babylonian knowledge and Babylonian university, Daniel, every day, he went back. And you see that in Daniel 6. He went back to his custom of like, no, I'm going to refill myself with what I know I'm made of. I'm going to refill myself with the words of the Torah. I'm going to refill myself with prayer. I'm going to refill myself every single day to counteract everything that they're telling me every day. So that just became head knowledge. That didn't become who Daniel was. So even though he tried to fill him by, Daniel counteracted all of that. His nog would have gotten him in some trouble. And later on we see that. But as I think about Daniel, and I think about his three friends, and what they endured, that they endured slavery. I think about the situations that they faced in their lives. The pressure to compromise. The pressure to compromise. I think about us. Because it would have been so easy to do like the other captives did. It would have been easy to take the name. It would have been easy to eat the food. It would have been easy to embrace the education. It would have been easy to embrace what they wanted them to embrace. It certainly would have been an easier path than the road that they were going to take. But as I was thinking about them, I thought about us. And the same thing that their enemy, King Nebuchadnezzar, was trying to do to them, our enemy is trying to do to us. The enemy is trying to do it to me. The enemy is trying to do it to you. The enemy is Satan. It's a devil. It's Lucifer. Whatever you want to call him. He's the enemy. He's trying to do it to us. And he's constantly trying to change our identity. And he uses the same strategies. The thing about the devil is that he's not really inventive in the strategies that he uses. He's inventive in how he uses them, but the strategies are still the same. And the same thing that he did to try to do with Daniel and his friends is the same thing he's trying to do to us, which he's trying to rename us. He's trying to tame us, and he's trying to claim us. And that's what the enemy is trying to do. Every single day that you wake up, he's trying to rename you into something that God didn't create you to be. He's trying to give you some names that God didn't give you. For Daniel and his friends, the names were like defeated, fearful, slave. And some of you right now are walking around with some of those names. You're walking around those names, and I want to tell you this morning that God didn't give you those names. God didn't give you those names. The devil is trying to rename you into something. He's also trying to tame you. You know how he tries to tame you? He tries to tame you with by encouraging you to do things with your bodies that God didn't design for you to do with your bodies. One of the things that God didn't, for some people it's, He's trying to tame you with the allure of illegal substances that you put inside your body. For some people, it is legal substances, but you're just overusing it, or you're just abusing it. And it's taming you because the way that it tames you is that all of a sudden you have no moral ground to stand on. All of a sudden you can't be the father that you want to be. All of a sudden you can't be the mother that you want to be, or the friend that you want to be, or the employee that you want to be, because he's taming you through the abuse of this substance. And all of a sudden, the warrior inside of you, the person inside of you is being held back down. And he's trying to tame you with that. But you know what? You're more than conquerors. You're more than conquerors. He can't tame you. Whatever happened yesterday, happened yesterday. It ain't got to happen tomorrow. Don't let anybody give you any name from the past. You got to be like Rafiki said, the past. Rafiki was a prophet. It is in the past. If you don't, you need to watch Lion King. I tell you, I was like, lots of great stories in Lion King. And he's trying to claim you. He's trying to give you and educating you and giving you human wisdom that is contrary to God's wisdom. He's trying to give you wisdom that's not, and it sounds really good. How many of you know there's a way that seems right to man, but that way leads to destruction, that way leads to death? That's a proverb, by the way. And his tactics for doing this is really simple. He uses three main things to get us to change our identity. The first thing that he uses is people. He uses people, and people who will say stuff to us. They'll say stuff to us like, man, he no good. He a cheat. And they may be right that he cheated. But people tend to take a mistake, a sin, and they define your entire future of one thing or two things or maybe 10 or 20 things. But I thank God that God says your future is not defined by your past. Your future is defined by me, and I define your future. I define your future. And sometimes they give you names that, based on things you use. Sometimes it's just a name. And sometimes it's even a nickname. Now, when I was growing up in Jamaica, everybody had a nickname. They gave everybody a nickname. And, and I don't even know why they do it. I have a good friend of mine. She was here a couple weeks ago. Her name is Deborah. But from the moment she was born, they named her Deborah on her birth certificate, and it says, we're going to call you Ingrid. I don't know why they did that, but that's what we do. Just give you a name legally, and then we give you another name. But usually, you get another nickname when you're going out through school. My name was Babyface, which wasn't a bad name. I really wish that name would come back, because everywhere I go now, they ask Donna, one time they asked Donna if she was my daughter. I was like, whoa. They said, it's nice that the father is taking his daughter out to lunch. Till finally I started to own it. I'm like, that's right. I'm the man. I'm old, but I still got it. But they give nicknames. There was a guy that we knew growing up. We called him, I don't know why, somebody called him Sleepy. His name was Sleepy. And I don't know, that guy might have been the most alert guy in the world ever. But every time I looked at him, he could have been dancing. He just looked sleepy. You know why? Because he had the name Sleepy. And so we know him all throughout my time in Jamaica before we came here was Sleepy. But you want to see even worse? My brother, I hope he's watching this. My brother is one of my heroes, by the way. I love that guy. He went out with Sleepy's sister one time. So when he came home from the date, I asked him, yo, what is Sleepy's sister's name? He's like, I don't know. I was afraid to ask her. I'm like, all this time, he's like, I never thought to. Anyway, that's, young boys nonsense. My wife faced a similar thing my wife's a pharmacist. When she got out of pharmacy school, And she got this job, she was working with IVs and they were mixing drugs and all this. She's mixing all, and Donna's like, she don't want to kill anybody. She's mixing the drugs and she's doing it slow. She's checking it twice, like Santa Claus, right? Checking this, checking it twice. And the tech started calling her Turtle Girl. And Donna would come home, she goes, I am not good, I'm no good, I'm Turtle Girl, I'm Turtle Girl, I'm Turtle Girl. So I thought about buying her some turtles, but that probably wouldn't have been a marriage enhancing move, so I didn't. So after she got faster, then she's like, all right, I'm going to do things ahead of time. So they started calling her Future Girl. Anyway, so Future Girl. But another thing that he uses is not only people, he uses misplaced priorities. He uses misplaced priorities. And in our culture, we're bombarded with media. We're bombarded with social media. We're bombarded with regular media, news media. We're bombarded with music. And we're bombarded with so many messages that's contrary to what and it's kind of funny, right? Each one of us have our own pet peeves. I mean, there's something like, about me. We get to the point where it's okay to call somebody a girl the B word. And it's okay. It's okay to call a boy F-boy. And that's okay. It's okay to call somebody a thought. And it's okay. And you know what happens after that? They accept that identity. And they accept that identity. You know what else happens after that? You start living up to that identity. To use this misplaced priorities. We got to counteract those misplaced priorities. We got to counteract it. The other thing that he uses is places where we get our human wisdom from. Where we get our wisdom from. He uses us to get human wisdom. And we're getting our knowledge and information from people who don't know diddly about squat. They don't know diddly squat. You can Google diddly squat if you don't know what diddly squat is. It means exactly that, diddly squat. I see all the time that married people will go to single people and ask them for advice on marriage. I'm like, what are you doing? Hey, I don't know. If they knew something, like, what are you doing? Or ask somebody who's divorced 3 times. I'm like, no, don't take any advice because you're going to be. And all these things that the devil does is all designed to rename you, to tame you, and to claim you. And he's really, really good at it. He's been doing it for thousands of years. And you wonder why so many are walking around the place defeated, depressed, oppressed. Because he's really good at it. And you're taking on an identity that God did not give you. And I want us all to say this morning, myself too, no more. No more. It stops right here. We draw the line right here. No more, devil. You can't rename me. You can't tame me. You can't claim me. No more. 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 It stops right here. It's time today to take a stand. It's time to take a stand. It's time to take a stand. And I'm going to give you some ways to do that. Romans 12:2 says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. See, the world has a pattern. The world has a pattern that it wants us to conform to. Things that were once upon a time were taboo is no longer taboo. Because society says that it's okay. But if it runs contrary to what God's word said, who designed all of us and designed this world and put it into order and says, if you want a better life, then follow along these paths, because he's the one who's created it. Then the reality is that when we're doing that, we're conforming to a pattern, a societal pattern. And the word that I think about here is compromise. Because you see, what happens is that the devil just breaks us down little by little by little by little by little. And he gets us to compromise. So, the first step to do is to stand without conforming. Stand without conforming. Or another word to say is stand without compromising. There's a time where you got to say, this is the line. I'm not going to cross that line. I'm not going to cross that line. No, like Daniel said, you can call me Belshazzar, but I ain't going to eat your food. That's my line. I ain't going to eat your food. I'm not going to defile myself with your food. You cross the line. Each one of us, we have lines that we need to set. And we think about it, we need to set some boundaries in our lives. And we see this compromising thing happen. I was speaking to a young lady the other day, and she's a follower of Jesus. And she was telling me, she was like, you know, I would never get married to my boyfriend without moving in first. And I said, well, tell me why, right? And she's like, well, I got to try it out. Like, makes logical sense. But it's contrary to what God said. You know, you're just following what society is saying that would do it. And there's a path that seems right to man, but that path leads to destruction. So stand without conforming. Romans 12:2 goes on and says, don't copy the behavior and customs of the world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think. By changing the way that you think. Folks, stand by transforming your mind. Stand by transforming your mind. And you know, I know people say this all the time, that the stuff I listen to doesn't bother me. The stuff that I watch doesn't bother me. The people that I listen to doesn't bother me. It's really what comes out of my heart that's what's important, what comes out of my mouth. But how many of you know it's I'm a technologist, and in IT there's a term that says GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Because you can't spit out something that you didn't input. You just literally can't do that. And you know, numerous studies says that it does affect you. Psychological studies. Years ago in 1973, there was a bank robbery, a famous bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. And in that bank robbery, they captured 4 hostages for 6 days. The bank robbers did. And an amazing thing happened that became a whole theory of psychology that came out of this. But what happened is something called Stockholm Syndrome. What happened was the people who were captured, the hostages, they went from fear of their captors. And as they spent more time with their captors, they went to sympathy for their captors. And after they went from sympathy, they went to admiration of their captors. And eventually, when they got freed, they actually testified in defense of their captors. And for many of us, if we're not careful, Stockholm Syndrome is happening to us. And it's time to take a stand. We got to stand by transforming our mind and recognize what's happening out there. We got to surround ourselves with people. And that's why we talk about destiny steps and we talk about getting in a group. You got to surround yourself with people who are chasing after the same things that you are chasing after. You got to go hang out with people who are desiring the same things that you do. And by the way, I'm not saying don't hang out with anybody else, but I'm talking about counterbalancing. I'm talking about counterbalancing. Counterbalancing your media with wholesome media. And there should never be a day that goes that you listen to only things that are B this and F this and this and this. Without, I would say don't listen to it at all, but I'm saying without making sure that you're grounded in some good worship music. You know, Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, he said this. He's like, hey, kind of want you want to make sure, you want to know how to do this thing? Fix your eyes on the things that are true, the things that are noble, the things that are just. Whatever is lovely, whatever is of good report, And I like this. The things to focus our minds on, to get a daily diet on, if there is any virtue, if there's any virtue in it, and if there's anything praiseworthy, think. Meditate on these things. Folks, I want to tell you that man, I can't tell you enough. If you want to make sure that you can stand, you got to stand by transforming the things that you focus your mind on. And the final thing that I'll say here is to stand for your calling. It's not only stand without compromising or conforming. It's not only stand by transforming the way you think, but the fact is that God has put an identity and He's put a calling to each and every one of us. The reality is that He's put a calling on each and every one of us, and He's created us with a unique identity. You know, there's no two human beings with the exact same DNA. And He created each one of us for a specific purpose. And you know, in Jeremiah 1:5 illustrates this. God was speaking to the prophet Jeremiah. And I just want us to hang out and just think about this verse for a second. It says, before I formed you, this is God saying to Jeremiah, in your mother's womb, in the womb, I knew you. Before you were even thought about, before your daddy thought your mommy was cute, before your granddaddy even thought your grandmommy was cute, I knew you, and I set you apart, and I appointed you. And the same thing that He told Jeremiah is the same thing He's telling you, and you, and you. And He's saying, Daniel, before you're formed in your mother's womb. He's saying, John. He's saying, Jessica, before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you, and I set you apart. See, if you want to become a history maker, that people are impacted by you and your life for generations, because that's what each one of us were purposed to do. And sometimes we think about legends in many different ways, but we're called to be a history maker in so many ways from our children. We're called to be a history-making mom, a history-making dad, a history-making businessman, a history-making pharmacist, a history-making custodian, a history-making teacher. And the list goes on and on. The thing is, you'll always fall short of that if you don't take a stand. If you don't take a stand, you always fall short of that. So you know me, I try to give something for you to remember, because you probably won't remember this, but I want you to remember this. You won't remember everything else, but you remember this. If you want to keep from falling, you got to take a stand for your calling. If you want to keep from falling, you got to take a stand for your calling. It begins by taking a stand. Is it bold? Yeah. Is it scary? Yeah. Is it going to require some sacrifice? Yeah. But you know, investing is you sacrifice something for a much greater return. And I tell you that I have not followed Jesus, and I followed Jesus, and following Jesus is a whole lot better than not following Jesus. That's personal experience, and one day I'll tell you my story. So be bold. Be bold. Take a stand. Take on your identity that Jesus gave you, or take it back. Whether it's salvation, that you need to say yes to Jesus, take a stand. Or whether it's the baptism, take a stand. Or whether it's the 21-day challenge, take a stand. Whether it's being a good parent, take a stand. Don't let it be defined by your past, but take a stand. Let me just commit you to prayer. Father, I just want to thank you for each person here. Lord, I thank you that they're here. Lord, I pray that this word will go out and encourage them the way that it encouraged me. No compromise. Focus my mind on the right things. Discover my purpose and take a stand. Bless each and every person that they'll not walk out of the way in which they came in. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks so much for watching. You know, if you did make that decision to follow Jesus, we want to say best decision ever.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just about finding Jesus, but it's about following Jesus into the best story of your life. And we want to help you take some next steps, and you can do that by texting New Story to 94,000.
And if you happen to live in the South Florida area, we would love to connect with you and hear your story. Just text GRPS, that's groups without the vowels, GRPS to 94,000 to find out how to connect in one of our amazing groups that runs across South Florida.
And if you're loving these messages and you're loving the ministry of History Makers Church, we can partner together to make an epic and eternal difference all around the world. And you can do so by texting HMGIVE to 94,000. Thanks so much for your generosity, and see you soon.